Hello to you all. If you are joining us, we just finished watching Hacksaw Ridge. I hope you've seen it too, whether you watched it tonight or whether you watched it a previous time. And we're going to talk about it, think about it, wrestle with some of the themes in it. If you haven't watched it, it is an excellent movie, and you definitely should do that. We're sharing again to our respective church Facebook pages, so people can find the live stream on those pages. I'm not sure. Okay. All right. I think we are almost ready to start talking.
Yep, give us one more minute. Sorry about the delay.
That's just going to be an awkward part of this, probably always. Since we have 5 different church pages, and then our own
collars with sleeves, and then our own pages. So that's, what would that be, 8 pages altogether?
Yeah, something like that.
Just
so
a couple.
Takes a little bit to get this live stream out on all of those things. All right. Okay.
So it looks like we've got a few of you already here with us. Hopefully you got to see the movie already. Cindy was already saying that. Forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but some of you might have showed up since then. But yeah, hopefully you've already gotten to see it. And if you haven't, well, we're going to spoil it for you, but it's a historic movie, so you could probably, maybe you've already heard of the story of Desmond Doss. He is quite the man. I was just absolutely blown away by that movie when I first saw it.
Yeah, I think I actually saw it on a transatlantic flight. I think that's when I watched it flying from somewhere, which it looks like I won't be doing again for
a long time.
While. But anyway, so if you have watched it, then you know that Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist and held pretty serious pacifist views, and
very serious pacifist views.
And he ends up enlisting, serving in World War II in the Pacific arena. Refuses to carry a weapon, but enlists as a medic in order to save lives, and that's a huge commitment in the face of violence. And I know that Derek made some notes that I think we'll talk about in just a minute, as he was watching the movie.
So one of the things to kind of describe how we even saw it in the first place, we were headed overseas right after Easter, because sometimes we take our vacation like right then because we're exhausted after Holy Week. And I actually, on a whim, just saw this movie and I was like, sure, I'll watch it. I saw something on, like, I think it was like the Today Show when I was having breakfast someplace, and Vince Vaughn was in it. He was being interviewed, and I was like, okay, sure. Another war movie, why not? I'll put it on in the background. I wasn't really planning on paying close attention. And as I started watching it, I realized there was a lot of language about God and a lot of language about country. And in general, um, most cinematic experiences, most cinematic movies and shows tend to wed these two concepts together, that flag and cross stand for the same thing. And over the course of my life, I realized that's not always the case. There are times where they are definitely an uneasy relationship, and there are other times where they're in direct conflict with one another. And so it piqued my interest. I'm like, okay, what are they doing here? And it was the first time I'd ever seen in a movie that the two weren't wed together, at least not perfectly or not fluidly. And it was such a profound movie that we were literally in the midst of landing, and I was at the tail end of the movie. And I pay attention during landings because I get a little scared during takeoff and landing. And I usually pay deep, like very close attention. I didn't even notice we were landing. I'm just like, must watch the end of this movie. And it literally cut off in the scene at the end where it's like explaining what happened afterwards. And it just killed me because I had to wait until the return flight just to watch those 20 seconds. But it was worth it. I mean, it was that good of a movie. I was in tears. I told Cindy, you have to watch this movie. It's just absolutely profound. And it tells the story of Desmond Doss, and he's a Seventh-day Adventist, which is a Protestant sect that has some very unique beliefs. They believe Sabbath is on Saturdays. They're vegetarians. I forgot that detail until he gave some food away, some meat away. And they are, I believe, pacifists from his convictions, though it does show in the story that he has some personal baggage that leads to his vehement pacifism.
Which, actually, I'd kind of like to start out by thinking about that. And by the way, as always, if you've watched and if you have things that you want to contribute in the comments that you observe, put them up there. But yeah, it is a great movie, Angie. Love it. So one of the things that I find pretty compelling is Desmond's backstory. You know, he comes from a family where there was domestic violence, where he was roughhousing with his brother when they were kids, and I mean he hurt him quite badly. But one of the scenes that really struck me was, you know, when he's kind of flashing back to that scene where he is actually holding up a gun to his father, and his father is saying, shoot me. And you can tell he is really, really tempted to do it. And for me, that really captures the struggle towards nonviolence, towards pacifism. You know, it's not an easy thing to choose that path. It's not a natural inclination, especially in the face of violence and danger. The temptation, the instinct is to return violence with violence. And yet he makes a clear choice in that moment to resist that temptation.
But he did actually go on to say that in his heart he killed him. In his heart he killed him, which is what I think what weighed so heavy on him, is that whether he pulled that trigger or not, he knew in his heart that he could have, and he almost did, and that was the moment that locked it in, is he knew he could kill, and it scared the bejesus out of him. And that was the moment he vowed to be a true and genuine pacifist, to never take up a firearm again. And then for him to join the military during World War II, I mean, it's kind of like, well, there's a lot of stuff you can do, but I mean, if that's your vow, why are you doing that? And he ended up talking about, like, you know, on Pearl Harbor, he knew what he needed to do. And pretty much everybody in his town did it. He even talks about two people that were rejected from the military. I don't know what the code was that they used, but they were forced to come back. Maybe it was medical, maybe it was bad behavior. I'm not sure. But because of that dishonor, they actually committed suicide. So he used that as an example of saying how serious this was for everybody that was there.
Yeah, and well, and I think too that very much sets up this understanding, because I think some people, when they hear the word pacifist, they think of somebody who kind of hides from things, or maybe is a coward, or is afraid. And he's very much like, no, I want to serve. It's in fact an incredible act of bravery to be willing to go into war without carrying a weapon. And that for me is a powerful moment. He's not retreating. He's not hiding. Like, he's stepping out into the mess, but he's choosing a different way.
And that's the thing. I've heard Reverend Jenny Williams really say beautifully, just talk about, like, there are the ways of the world, and we're often told that there's one way or the other. In our country today, it's Democrat or Republican, and you got to choose a side. And consistently, the language that Jenny just put so eloquently is there's always a third way that God guides us to, that God leads us to, that it's above the ways that the world often tells us. You're good or you're bad, you're for us or you're against us. And he's like, well, I'm for you, I'm not against you, but at the same time, I'm not going to be for you in the way that you want me to be, which is bearing arms, because I have made a vow before God that I won't do that.
Yeah, and that third way is a phrase that Jenny has taken from the theologian Walter Wink. And he writes about the third way, especially in looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as finding a third way of being. And as Christians, we're called to discern and to live in this third way.
And even John Wesley had the Via Media, the middle way. Maybe not as eloquently put as the third way with Walter Wink, but still, it's this common thread over and over and over throughout Christendom, that we are called to be in this world, but not of this world. And Desmond Doss shows a way of doing that. So the part that really hooked me for the movie, because it was kind of just happy-go-lucky, typical World War II build up. He's going to go serve. I like the fact that he is an Appalachian boy. Shows him climbing the mountains over and over, and it's just like that. That struck a chord with me. And it was it was a good, happy time at the very beginning. He met the love of his life. He wants to get married to her, and he goes off to basic. And up until that point, everything was going perfectly well, just like every other movie prior. However, when he gets to basic, it soon turns very dark very quickly. And the part that really gets me is that he's not popular with his I guess, squad, with those living in his barracks beforehand, but he's not like unpopular. But what ends up happening is that the sergeant and the captain refuse to accept his ability to be a conscientious objector. And Doss, well, at least the language in the movie was, I'm not a conscientious objector, I'm a conscientious cooperator. And I like that phrase because he is cooperating, he just won't do that one thing. He wants to save lives, but they cannot wrap their head around this other mindset. And so what it tends to happen is when we can't understand something, we as humans tend to lash out and attack it. And that's exactly what they do. They start making his life just absolutely horrible. And it does nothing. He continues on. So what they then do is they make the lives of his entire barracks awful. And little by little, people begin turning on him more and more. And just the sheer amount of betrayal and the sheer amount of ridicule that he gets, it very much reminds me of just the Passion itself. I mean, he was beaten in the dead of night, put on a sham trial, I mean, for a court martial. All of these things, I'm not saying it lines up perfectly, but it has this constant harmony with the Passion narrative. And it's just, when we're asked to take up our cross and follow Christ, I look at those scenes and I look at what he had to do to be a conscientious cooperator, and I mean, there's a serious cost, and he bears it, and it sucks. I mean, there's nothing good about it, nothing good at all.
And did you write down what he said when he was being, like, when he was at the trial, when he was being court-martialed, where he talked about, like, the world is tearing itself apart?
So it said specifically, this was his defense about why he wanted to be a combat medic, and not take up an arm, take up a rifle. With the world so set at tearing itself apart, it doesn't seem like such a bad thing to me to want to put a little bit of it back together. That line was just like, oh, just hit me like a punch in the gut. I mean, to see all the brokenness and to endure at that point all the pain and all the shame, and still to just say that he just wants to piece it back together just a little bit. I mean, it's powerful.
Yeah. And I see Angie said, he was a passionate man, and he was, like, he was really intense and committed to what he was doing. And time and again he would find a way where especially when they were on the battlefield, and one guy's like, no, leave him, he's not gonna last a day, he's not gonna last an hour, and he's like, and the guy who's there on the ground severely injured is like, no, don't leave me. And he's like, I'm not gonna leave you, I'm gonna get home. And he's determined in a way that takes a lot of courage, and one, I can't imagine being in that kind of setting, and enduring that kind of stuff and having that kind of response.
One of the things that really, the depiction of that I just think is so amazing is they don't pull punches. It's, I mean, there's that phrase, war is hell. And it's hell. I mean, let's call it what it is. If there is a moment in this world that sees the gaping maw of hell itself, it is war. And often when we're confronting these evil forces in a very real way, the darker side of humanity comes out. And I mean, it's very clear that you do what you have to in those moments, and good men and good women end up doing things that weigh heavy on their conscience and souls for the rest of their lives. And that happens. That happens because war is hell. It happens. And yet, in the face of this, you have Das, who's just still not picking up a rifle, picking up a weapon. He even has this dream where he's getting skewered, and he just realized, I can do nothing to defend myself. But rather than do something to defend himself, it's just kind of an awful realization, but that just is what it is. That's where he is.
Yeah. See, if somebody's saying, I thought I remember hearing it was supposed to be excusable to kill in war, both in Judaism and Christianity. Well, and this leads to a very interesting discussion, and there is not one singular Christian response to this. There is a long tradition of pacifism, But there is also a long tradition of what's called just war theory.
And it originated, at least was codified in writing by St. Augustine,
Mm-hmm.
who our son is named after.
Yes, not because of just
no, not
war
because
theory.
of that, but just to say that I mean, he was the first great philosopher of the church and
Mm-hmm.
wrote down many amazing philosophies. And I mean, he put eloquently into words what was the belief of many Christians at the time. But by no means was it the only belief.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout Christendom, throughout Christian history, you have these two views, and at times one speaks louder than the other, but at other times it reverses, and it's a back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's good that they are constantly wrestling with one another. But one thing I do want to say about just war theory is that does not mean that any war or any type of battlefield violence is acceptable. There are some really strict parameters on what constitutes just war. So strict, in fact, I mean, I would venture to say it's really hard in modern warfare, if not impossible, to meet all of those categories of what is classical just war theory.
There's no place for a preeminent strike at all in
mm-hmm.
just war theory. One must have been attacked
mm-hmm.
first. It is a response. It is never
mm-hmm. something
done first. And in most modern warfare, there is this language of a preeminent strike,
mm-hmm.
and this is this happens consistently, and it's with good intelligence. I mean, I'm not questioning the rationale behind it, but
mm-hmm.
according to the strict codified rules that St. Augustine put down, that have been adopted by many Christians throughout over a millennia, that we really struggle today.
Yeah, and there certainly is violence in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and that's probably a lot deeper than we can really get into tonight on this, but maybe that's a topic we'll take up on a Theology Thursday. But one thing that I would add is like this whole question of the relationship between the Christian and violence of any kind is one that I've wrestled with like forever. And I say that I am a pacifist by desire. Like that is what in my heart I want to be. But I also recognize the reality of the world we live in, and recognize that sometimes violence might be the only way. I don't want to say it definitely is, but in some situations, maybe that's what has to happen. And I did my senior thesis in college on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, if you heard of him, he was a German theologian and pastor. He lived during the time of the Third Reich. He was a part of the movement of the Confessing Church, where they attempted to resist Hitler. He was pacifist, and you see this in his writings, in his way of being, but he ultimately becomes involved in the underground resistance and takes part in an assassination attempt on Hitler. And he was arrested and eventually hanged for that. And so a question that I always had was how did he change his ethics? Did he move from being a pacifist to something different? Did he somehow think that violence was a good thing? And what I found in his writings through studying him is that he never truly believed that violence was ever good or ever something that God desired. And he said, in his action in attempting to assassinate Hitler, this is what he said. He said, before my own conscience, I'm justified in this action. Before my fellow people, I'm justified because there's good reason for this. But before God, I can hope only for grace. In other words, doing violence to another human being, no matter how evil, that was never seen as something good in God's eyes. Maybe a lesser evil, but not a good. And ultimately, he could only hope for God's grace. And that is what I come back to over and over and over again. And I'm sure this is a question I'll wrestle with for my entire life. Um, and I'll probably keep finding myself back at that place of, before God, I can hope only for grace.
And that's where we're talking about, like, in those moments where hell erupts on this earth, where war happens, and good men and women make not bad choices, but difficult choices that weigh heavy. I think for here on earth, we are justified in logic and in reason. We're justified by our peers and what has been done. I mean, there is justification, real justification, but really, I think what weighs heavy is it's only by God's grace, genuinely, that forgiveness can happen, because regardless of whether it was right or wrong, there is genuine brokenness that existed, no questions asked, and the very least confessing that the brokenness was just part of what you lived into. I mean, I think that's an honest thing. And living in a modern society, there's brokenness that we all live in. I mean, there are issues that are greater than any of us, things that we have some guilt in, whether it be the military-industrial complex, whether it be climate change, whether it be countless other things, that whether it be our tax dollars that go towards, or the money we put into the economy, whether it promotes things we stand for or whether we don't stand for. I mean, these things are greater than us. And I think that there's a point where, it's too big for us to handle firsthand, but what we can at the very least do is confess before God that we struggle.
Yeah. Well, and the thing, I mean, and again, the thing that I think I most appreciate about the person of Desmond Doss, realizing this is not a fictional narrative, this is a real human being who lived. He did not retreat from the brokenness of the world. He went into the mess of it and was alongside, his, fellow soldiers. And even though he was not carrying a weapon, he went into the mess. And that in and of itself is a very Christ-like image. When we talk about Christ, we talk about this word, the incarnation, which means in the flesh, of Christ entering into our weakness and our brokenness and emptying self of his power to live and suffer and die with us in our mess.
And there are moments where saints shine forth. And this was one of those moments where other good men were alongside of him. Good men that were doing what they were called to do in the midst of the brokenness. Desmond knew his calling very, very much. He had an open line of communication with God. Not that he heard the voice of God, but he knew through scripture and through prayer. It's very clear that those were absolutely formative to him. And there's a moment, one of the other moments that I had to write down it word for word. It's Desmond is sitting at the top of Hacksaw Ridge, and the retreat has been sounded. Everybody is back off the hill, and he just lost one of his worst enemies that became his friends, Smitty, I believe it was, and in that moment he's just having this breakdown. He says, What is it you want of me? I don't understand. I can't hear you. He's crying out to God with these words, and it is heartbreaking. And then all of a sudden in the background, you hear this very faint scream.
Medic, help. Medic, help. And is that the voice of God speaking, where he can go and he can be of help? And at the very end, when they actually go to interviews with the real Desmond Doss, he talks about what he was thinking about when he was up there. And it was something like he just kept saying to himself,
Lord, please help me get one more.
Please help me get one more. And so, when he was doing this, he wasn't thinking of this like monumental thing that he was doing. He was just, how can I help just one more? Just one more, just one more. And isn't that the way to go through life? How can I help just one more? Just one more.
And that's the whole language of like, there's this story about just all these starfish that are washed up on the shore, and they're all drowning, and this guy's just going down the beach, just throwing one at a time, and there's just thousands of them. It's an impossible task, and someone just watches him for a while and walks up and goes, "Why are you doing that? Look at how many there still are.
You can't possibly save them all."
And the guy just looks at him as he throws one more back in the water, and it says, "It mattered for that one."
Yeah.
And that's all we can do. I mean, it's just one, but you know what? Those drops, they add up.
And so maybe that's a good note for us to end on tonight, just thinking about those overwhelming situations. But if we can think like Desmond, just, Lord, help me get one more. Help me help one person today. And maybe that's how we move through the coming days.
And in the movie, I mean, one of the final screens shows that he ended up saving 75 people. Lord, help me get one more. If he was told by God at the beginning, you're going to save 75 people, he probably wouldn't believe it, because it literally was a single person at a time.
Well, thanks for watching and joining us. We'll do this again at some point.
Next Friday.
Probably.
We're going to try and find a movie or a show for next Friday. Keep posted. We don't know what it is just yet. We are going to try and do a Netflix watch party because, unfortunately with this, it was rental or buy only, or if you had it already or saw it before. But we're going to try and find something on Netflix that we can all watch together and actually have a watch party. So as we're watching it, maybe the discussion happens during the movie.
Because there is apparently a chat function in Netflix Watch Party, which you will need a computer to watch that, and I think Google Chrome as your platform in order to do it. But stay tuned. We're going to kind of figure that stuff out this week, so maybe we can chat along as we watch a movie next time. So
hope you enjoyed it. Hope this is a blessing, and hopefully this can become part of the new normal as we seek to live faithfully, even in our consumption of media as we are quarantined. Because God blesses us through all sorts of different means. And like Dr. Chris Williamson said, art, as it points to the deeper truth, to the deeper beauty, it is in a way sacramental because it points to God's very essence.
Yep.
So good art, movies that make us think, that's good art.
So, well, good night, and we hope that you all have a peaceful rest. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.